Okay, we were just replacing a battery for those of you who are at home. Welcome to Albright Live. We are live streaming today on YouTube. Welcome to everybody at home. A few announcements first. Upcoming lectures. The next lecture will be on Thursday, March 1st, where we're pleased to host our president, that is the Albright Institute president, Sharon Herbert, who will be talking about new work on the ceilings and the archive from Tel Kedesh. And while I'm mentioning Sharon, I will announce the publication of Tel Anefah, Volume 2, which completes the Tel Anefah series, is edited by Andrea Berlin and Sharon Herbert for their number of seasons of excavation there. And congratulations to them. Anefah is now completely published, which a lot of sites can't claim. Congratulations. Clapping ensues. The next workshop after that, Thursday, March 8th, where Andrew Henry, one of our ECA fellows, will be talking about early Christian liturgy and protective inscriptions in the 5th and 6th century Syria. So don't miss those next two lectures. For now, let me introduce Ian Jones, who's one of our ECA fellows, to introduce the speaker.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Rangar H. Cline. Rangar earned his PhD in 2005 at Penn State University and is now Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Oklahoma and National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow here at the Albrights. He's the author of Ancient Angels, Conceptualizing Angeloi in the Roman Empire, published by Brill in 2011, as well as numerous articles dealing with angels, amulets, and pilgrimage souvenirs in Late Antiquity. He's a former Fulbright Fellow and regular member at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and a staff member at the Legio excavations in Israel. He's also, or was formerly, assistant director of the Vicus ad Martis excavations in Italy, and he's excavated at Corinth and Megiddo, I think among others, right? Rangar is at the Albright now working on a book project titled Religious Travel and Evidence of the Holy in Late Antiquity, a study of the evolution and economic consequences of pilgrimage in late antiquity. This evening, he'll be speaking about the ways in which Christian accounts of pilgrimage to the Holy Land presented altered landscapes, water sources, relics, and miracles as evidence of the authenticity of holy sites in his workshop titled, appropriately, The Authenticity of Holy Sites in Christian Pilgrimage Narratives, circa 300 to 600 CE. Please welcome Dr. Rangar Cline.
All right. Thanks, Ian. And I'd like to say thank you to you all for coming out tonight. I'd also like to say thanks to the Albright for supporting the project, and thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for providing funds for my fellowship and for sponsoring other research in the humanities, social sciences, and in the discipline of archaeology. So I'd like to start by talking about the main question that this project tries to answer. The main question I'm dealing with is the question of how pilgrims presented evidence for the authenticity of the sites they visited. And furthermore, how they authenticated their own journeys. So in other words, what types of evidence did they present in their narratives, and were they shown when they traveled that were understood to demonstrate the veracity of those sites and that they were in the right locations. So the project as a whole, as Ian was indicating, goes a little bit beyond what I'm talking about this evening. So today I'll be talking about Christian narratives between 300 and 600 and how some of those narratives demonstrate the authenticity of holy sites. The project as a whole, let's see if I can advance. There we go. Okay. The project as a whole looks at some other things too. The project actually starts with looking at the ways in which holy sites are demonstrated to be authentic in the Greek and Roman world. And I won't have time to talk about that research very much this afternoon. However, I will talk about a few examples in just a moment to let you know what I mean by looking at how those narratives demonstrate the authenticity of holy sites before we move on to some of the ways in which Christian narratives, which I discuss in chapters 2 through 4, demonstrate the authenticity of those sites. And the ones with the asterisk are the ones that I've been working on here at the Albright. So those are the ones I'll be focusing on tonight. And if we have time, we can talk a little bit about the last chapter, which looks at another way that Christian narratives demonstrated the authenticity of pilgrimage. One of the arguments this book makes is that in Greek and Roman pilgrimage accounts, there are presentations of things like altered landscapes, fountains, springs, and things like that, that demonstrate the veracity of past epiphany and ongoing divine presence. The earliest Christian narratives, like the BORDEAUX Pilgrim, I argue, present things in a very similar way. But the book also argues that Christian narratives and the presentation of sites start to diverge from that earlier tradition. And one way in which Christian tradition diverges as well is with the idea of authentic pilgrimage being manifest through the suffering of the pilgrim. So in other words, the idea that the journey itself constitutes part of an authentic pilgrimage, which I have not found evidence for in earlier pilgrimage narratives. So there we go. So far it's working. So just to give you an example of some of what I mean in these earlier Greek and Roman pilgrimage accounts. So these are some examples from the Roman travel writer Pausanias, who wrote up until about 180 CE. So just to kind of look at a few of these examples, and as you can tell from the chapter numbers, these are all from early on, and these are run throughout Pausanias. He says, in the temple of, in the area, it's okay. In the area of the temple of Olympian Zeus, at the temple of Kronos and Rhea, the earth is split open about 2 feet. They say that this is where the water ran away after Deucalion's flood. And then in the next one, at the Erechtheion, there is seawater in a well, and when the wind blows from the south, the sound of waves come from it. The mark of Poseidon's trident is on the rock. So part of what you can see in these examples are the ways in which there are altered landscapes in the earth. Those are shown to pilgrims to demonstrate the veracity of stories. The stories also explain an otherwise unusual feature in a landscape. So there's a sort of circular logic in the way that these things demonstrate proofs to the pilgrim. Another thing you see here in some of these examples are the ways in which sounds demonstrate the authenticity of a site. For example, at the Erechtheion, there's the sound of the waves. We'll look at an example at Zion where there's a sound as well. So this idea of kind of auditory confirmation of a holy site. That you see in the next example at Megara as well, where there's a harp sound that comes when you throw a rock and it makes this harp sound. So those things for the pilgrim are unnatural occurrences that demonstrate that you're at the right spot, that the story really happened. The story also explains the otherwise unusual phenomenon. So all of those things kind of go together there. The last one at Troidzane, they have a fountain called the horse's fountain, where Pegasus' hoof struck the ground and caused a spring to come forth. This one is of a form that's found in a number of Christian pilgrimage accounts too. The idea that an epiphany occurred. When it occurred, the spring comes forth. The continuous flow of the spring demonstrates the veracity of the past story and so forth. This one also has a horse's hoof, which causes an indentation in the ground, and those can be found in the Abrahamic tradition as well. So we won't go much further into this, but this is to give you an example of what some of these earlier Greek and Roman traditions of authenticating sites via transformation of the natural landscape, what they look like. Okay. So the first Christian text that we'll look at is the Pilgrim from Bordeaux. I should mention before we start talking about the text that there are references to travelers before 333. However, those are kind of second-hand references. So in other words, Eusebius talks about earlier travelers and things like that. The Pilgrim from Bordeaux is the earliest continuous first-person narrative we have. So in that sense, it provides evidence for motivation and the kinds of ways that sites were presented to the pilgrim that the others don't. So just a few things about this one. Earliest first-person narrative. It's a relatively brief account. The Bordeaux pilgrim is possibly a Roman official. The reason for thinking that is because of the way the text seems to describe the pilgrim traveling on the cursus publicus, so possibly as someone of some importance. The text itself consists of 68 manuscript pages. Of those, only 13 manuscript pages are Holy Land description. The rest are pretty bare itinerary, so they just list distance, where the pilgrim stopped, and things like that. So very valuable, but they don't provide detailed descriptions of where the pilgrim's going and what he does. In that sense, those portions of the Bordeaux pilgrim are comparable to earlier itineraries like the Antonine itinerary. However, when the pilgrim gets to Caesarea, the text just expands, and he starts talking about lots of things that he sees. When he starts doing that, in a relatively brief section, there are 15 mentions of water sources at holy sites in those lines. So a relatively high proportion. Those tend to be fountains, springs, and things associated with holy stories. Susan Weingarten in '99 was the first person that I know of to kind of compile a list of all of those and how many there were. Weingarten's analysis was that those are in the tradition of Greek and Roman springs and so forth. I've also had people ask me, well, maybe he was just really thirsty as he went along, which is also possible. However, and there might be something to that you know, you're kind of stopping at sources to drink and so forth. However, he doesn't just say, and I stopped there and it's a good place to get a drink. He goes on to explain the origin of the spring and what it means and so forth. So there's clearly more to it in terms of meaning than just that. All right, so let's see if we can go to the next slide. There we go. Like I said, the text really expands at Caesarea. I should also point out that the narrative sections begin and end with water. So when he starts talking about Caesarea, he talks about the bath of Cornelius the centurion. When he closes out the descriptive parts, he talks about the site where Philip baptized the eunuch and Terebinth, so another two sites associated with springs. So they really kind of frame the narrative. In this case, I'm not suggesting that the governor's palace baths are what he saw. However, in the brief description here where he says, at Caesarea is the bath of Cornelius the centurion, it does seem that he's shown something that looks like a residential bath. And the same thing seems to be seen by Paula as described by Jerome some 50 or so years later. So I have not seen a convincing suggestion for what exactly he saw in the early 4th century. However, there are probably some people here who are very familiar with Caesarea who might have some good suggestions. So I'd be happy to hear those during the question and answer period. So he begins with this, with the balneus, which is a word that can mean bath. It can also mean baptistry. It's his regular word for baptistry as well. So one interpretation of this is that pilgrims are being shown not just a bath, but the place where they believed Cornelius was baptized according to the account in Acts. So that's quite possible. He then moves on from there to Mount SYNA or SHUNI, where he says there is a spring, a fons, in which a woman who washes becomes pregnant. Some of you might notice with this next one that there's nothing Christian about the place. He just is sort of describing it as this other place with a potent spring. And this is the sole example in the Bordeaux Pilgrim where he does this. In this case, he seems to describe it as something that demonstrates the overall potency of the land itself. He moves on from there, as Norma will know if she's here, to talk about Jezreel. So,
which Caesarea is?
That's Caesarea Maritima.
But SHUNI is in.
Right. He goes. This isn't a picture of SHUNI, but he goes from there to SHUNI. Oops. Okay. See if I can advance with my magical pen. Oh, go back. Okay. So. We'll talk about Jezreel in just a bit, but one of the best examples of a well that he presents occurs a little bit later when he goes on to Jacob's well. And this is the text. He says, Sychar, the place where the Samaritan woman came down, where Jacob dug the well in order to draw water, and our Lord Jesus Christ spoke to her. there are plane trees there planted by Jacob and a baptistry, and he uses that word balneus again, which is filled from the well. So there are a couple of things to note with this example. It's an ancient well attributed to Jacob. It still flows in the present. So if you're thinking about, well, how do you know exactly where this took place? He sees the well, the water's still there. The trees are also interesting. Those occur a number of places in pilgrimage accounts where there are trees attributed to the patriarchs or something like that. And they provide a connection, a living connection between the present and the ancient past. In this case, you have the well and the trees, and they're kind of in a self-confirming sort of circle. So they're all there together, therefore it's Jacob's well. Another thing to notice here is that it's not just that he's gone and seen Jacob's well. He also mentions that a baptistry has been placed there. So this is one of a number of places where he's describing these older Jewish sites which have been in some way Christianized. So there's kind of a Christian ritual that's taking place there. Which actually brings up something else that's interesting about the Bordeaux Pilgrim. John Williamson, in his translations and commentaries, has noted that most of the places in the Bordeaux Pilgrim are Jewish sites. So he seems to be kind of participating in an older tradition of visiting some of these places. And then he adds some that are distinctively Christian, like the Holy Sepulchre. Or if he goes to Jacob's well, he describes them in such a way where a Christian ritual has been added onto it. So he seems to be kind of writing on, as it were, something that's already taking place. All right, let's see if we can go to the next one. All right. So he visits some other places in and around Galilee, and then he goes towards Jerusalem. And when he enters Jerusalem, here's how he describes it. There are in Jerusalem 2 large pools beside the temple, one to the right and the other to the left, which Solomon built. Indeed, further inside the city are the twin pools, which have 5 porches, which are called Bethsaida, where those sick for many years used to be healed. Moreover, these pools have water that is turbulent and scarlet in appearance. So with Bethsaida there, I've just kept with the spelling of the Pilgrim. He seems to be describing, according to most analysis, with the large pool, the pool of Israel, which you can see in the ordinance map right here, which has since been filled in. The other pools are those associated with the Church of St. Anne, which weren't excavated when the ordinance map was made, but you can go see them now. So he's got the pools at Bethsaida next to St. Anne. He's got the big pool to his left, and then he seems to describe another one which hasn't been identified. But in terms of how this functions within the story, for him these are architectural or archaeological proofs of Solomon's building. So in this case, there doesn't seem to be anything that he can comment on the Temple Mount itself. So he's describing these large pools. They're important for that reason. They're also important because of how he'll describe the Holy Sepulchre, which we'll look at in just a second. So he's got these pools here. Another thing to note in terms of the healing at the pools at Bethsaida is that he uses this imperfect here, so they used to be healed. So miraculous things used to happen there, but they're not happening anymore. So he's kind of describing evidence for these stories, but he's going to move on to great things at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So both of those things are going on in that account. So let's see, and Constantine's. So in this case, just take a look at the text here. So a relatively brief description of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where he says, by order of the Emperor Constantine, a basilica has been built, and then he has to explain what basilica means, which is a Lord's building of amazing beauty, with cisterns on the side from which water is drawn, and behind them a bath where children are baptized. And some of you might know the standard English translation for this one by Wilkinson. In that translation, he translates it as the cisterns being of amazing beauty. And I really wish that's what it said, because it would be so much better for my thesis if he went around saying, these are great cisterns of amazing beauty. But I don't really think the text says that. I think you could push it to say that, but I think the more natural reading of it is that, and one that's grammatically possible, and I think the better translation, is that the basilica is of amazing beauty and the cisterns are beside it. But be that as it may, in a relatively brief account, it's those cisterns that he talks about. So, I mean, presumably there are lots of things he could talk about, but the cisterns are important to him. And it's also interesting that this follows his description of Solomon's temple remains, where he comments on Solomon's cisterns. So what has Constantine done? He's made a temple as well, and one with really great cisterns. So the focus remains, and in this case you have something that is kind of comparable to Solomon's, but still standing and of incredible beauty and so forth. So that's part of what he's doing in this one. And like with Jacob's well, here there's a balneus as well. So there are great cisterns and a place for children to be baptized. So I really wish that's what it said, but I don't think it says beautiful cisterns. Just a couple more examples from the Bordeaux pilgrim. As he's leaving Jerusalem, he says, when leaving Jerusalem, as you ascend Zion, on the left side, downwards in the valley next to the wall is a pool, which is called Siloam. It has 4 porticos and another large pool outside. The spring flows for 6 days and nights, but on the 7th day, it's a Sabbath day, during the whole of which it flows neither by night or day. So in this case, the Siloam pool observes the Sabbath as well. So you have a couple of things going together here. So you have the kind of architectural or archaeological evidence for these places, but it's confirmed by the miraculous behavior and the Sabbath observance of the well. So those kinds of things are going together in his account. In the Bordeaux pilgrim, he moves on from here. He goes south. He visits the spring where Philip baptized the eunuch, and he visits Terebinth as well. So it mentions the springs at both places before moving on to his itinerary. So in that way, you have these kind of water features, archaeological evidence, and miracles that validate and authenticate these sites for him. And a number of the ways in which these are described are consistent with the ways in which earlier Greek and Roman accounts of holy places work. Of course, in this one you have Sabbath observance, which isn't typical of a Greek or Roman site, but that's also something that makes this one interesting. The next pilgrim we'll talk about is maybe the more famous one, or most famous one, EGERIA. In EGERIA's account, she presents wells and fountains and springs too, but she does more than that. She authenticates these sites, but she also has a kind of justification for her own pilgrimage. She describes what she does at these sites and so forth. And in some ways, her account is probably a justification and an authentication of the pilgrimage as well. Just to note a few details, many of you probably already know this, but maybe not everyone knows about EGERIA, her dates and so forth. But dated to between 381 and 384, travels to Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Anatolia. In terms of where she's from, she describes herself as being from very distant lands, which is sometimes or usually interpreted as being Spain, sometimes southern Gaul. The middle section of her narrative survives, which is primarily the Sinai part and then parts of Palestine and Anatolia, parts of Syria. That can be supplemented by some other sources, including Peter the Deacon from the 12th century, who writes his own account of pilgrimage sites, and one of the sources he uses is EGERIA. So some of her account can be supplemented by that. There's also a manuscript from Madrid, which supplies a few stories that have fallen out of her account too. In terms of why she's doing it, she's, unlike the Bordeaux pilgrim, very clear. So describing what she's doing as being for the sake of prayer. And she'll see some of the same places the Bordeaux pilgrim does, but she'll describe praying there and reading a biblical text there and so forth. So in that way, she's kind of justifying and explaining what she's doing. In terms of genre, what we have in this surviving text also gives us an indication of why it was written. She goes to Constantinople, and she addresses it to her Domne Sorores, her dear sisters, which is one piece of evidence that she is probably a nun. So it's possible that she's addressing other Christians as sisters. However, there's this. There's also a part where she's copying down a letter of Akbar to bring back to her library back home. So that suggests, those things are very suggestive of her monastic origin. So not for certain, but very suggestive. So a little bit about EGERIA there. Now, okay. One of the places she goes to that I think illustrates the ways in which she looks for demonstrations of authenticity is when she goes to Moses Spring near Mount Nebo. When she goes there, she's escorted by a local bishop from Livius, which is another interesting thing about her account. She describes the holy men she goes with and so forth, which is something that the Bordeaux pilgrim doesn't do. It's also something that the Piacenza pilgrim doesn't do, and we'll talk about him in just a bit. So she kind of puts herself in connection with these religious authorities and figures and so forth. When she gets there, she describes it like this. She says, at that place, therefore, between the church and the monasteries, plentiful water flowed from the rock, intensely beautiful and clear, with unrivaled taste. And she goes on to say, this is the water which St. Moses gave the children of Israel in the desert. So for Egeria, the water of Moses still flows. She can go there, and another thing to note here is that the taste seems important. There are a number of places where it's clear and the taste is good. And those qualities seem to be indicative of its authenticity as well. And what else would you expect? Of course, Moses' water tastes good, but that's what she describes, and that seems to be important for her. At this site, like most others, she describes reading relevant passages about the story of Moses and praying and so forth, and so that sort of justifies why she's going there. Not just to see it, although she's going to tell you why it is the right place, but to offer prayers there as well. All right, so this one's for Norma. Jezreel is mentioned in the Bordeaux Pilgrim. In a fragment in Peter the Deacon, which is drawn from Egeria, this one goes a little bit further. It says, moreover, in Jezreel, the vineyard which was Naboth's is now just a well, and foundations of a tower are to be seen even to this day. Indeed, the tomb of Jezebel is stoned to this day by everyone. And yeah, well, and I like this one in part because the vineyard's not there apparently, but the well demonstrates that a vineyard was there in some way. So you have this connection of something that she can actually see and so forth, and that demonstrates the correctness of the placing of the vineyard. Now, just a couple more here. In this case, this one also drawn from Peter the Deacon's summaries of Egeria. Here she's describing going to HEPTAPEGON, or today is Tabga, the place of 7 springs, as she says, each flowing strongly. The stone on which the Lord placed the bread has now been turned into an altar. People who go there take away small pieces of the stone to bring them prosperity, and they are very effective. So this one's kind of interesting too. I mean, how do you locate the miracle of the loaves and the fishes? So you've got a stone, but how do you know it's the right stone? Well, you've got 7 springs, and together they kind of form this kind of cycle of proofs for the correctness of the place. Wilkinson, in his commentary on this, has noted, well, if you have a really nice place to sit with 7 springs and pilgrims are stopping there, maybe eventually they'll start to come up with some story about it, which may be the case. However, this one seems to be a really early kind of tradition that's where it took place, going back to the 4th century. Another thing that's worth noting here is what they're doing with the stone. They're taking pieces away. And the stone is so potent that it can work miracles at a distance. And the miracles at distance are also proof of the authenticity of the site. One thing to note here, and this is true of other instances in Egeria, she sometimes mentions other people doing this, but she doesn't describe doing it herself. So it seems to be like, well, people do this. But when she's describing her own actions, they have to do with prayer and Bible reading and things like that. That won't be the case when we get to the Piacenza pilgrim, who describes touching, tasting, feeling, and all kinds of things. But Egeria seems to focus on the text and prayer, although she does describe other people engaging with the site in other ways. Now, so far we've been looking at places that are authentic because of the clarity and good taste of the well and the water. This is another one that works a little bit differently. Job's dunghill. So in this one, this is supplied by the Madrid manuscript, and it supplies a page that fell out of the Egeria manuscript. And it says, the dunghill where Job sat is now a clean place surrounded by an iron railing where a great lantern burns each night. And where he scraped his sores with a potsherd, there is a spring which 4 times a year changes its color, becoming first the color of pus, then of blood, then of gall, then it's clear. Now, probably you wouldn't want to drink it during those other periods, but part of what's going on here is that the story kind of, the authenticity of the site manifests itself through the unusual behavior of the spring. And likewise, the story explains what's otherwise a really peculiarly behaving spring. So you can still see that kind of circular pattern of proof there. And then, one that's pretty well known. EGERIA goes north into ancient Syria, today's Turkey, and there she goes to EDESSA, where she meets the bishop, and the bishop tells her the story of King Abgar and his correspondence with Jesus. In that story, the letter that Jesus sent to Abgar is totemic. In other words, it's a kind of apotropaic thing that can be used to keep trouble away from the city. And the bishop tells EGERIA a story that the Persians besieged the city. Abgar took the letter out, and the Persians were driven back. However, the Persians still cut off the water supply to the city, at which point a spring came out of the city's citadel and began to flow. So God provides water to rescue the people of EDESSA, while the letter and its power keeps the Persians at bay. EGERIA comes to that spring, and then this is what she says about it. There are springs full of fish, springs the likes of which I have never seen. They are of such a size, so colorful, and of a good flavor. Now, some of you might know the standard English translation of this one as well, which says that, and this is a possible translation, although I don't think it's the correct one. In the standard English translation, it's not the springs that are of good flavor, but the fish. So the fish are of really great flavor, and I really want that one to be right too, just because I love the image of EGERIA just having some fish and thinking they're really great. However, I think while it's a possible reading, I think it's one that is the less likely and the less natural reading of the text. So I think here she's talking about the springs, which are beautiful and have a good taste and so forth, and there are fish in them too. I have the picture on the right of the Urfa pool because most scholars identify this spring and this pool, although modern Muslim tradition attributes it to Abraham. The most likely case is that these are the same springs in a similar pool in antiquity that she saw, and there are still fish in it too. So you can kind of see the fish in the photo. So the fish nowadays are sacred, so you are not supposed to eat them. So, all right, and that brings us to the last pilgrimage narrative that I'll talk about this afternoon. This one dates to about 570. It's by an anonymous traveler from the Italian town of Piacenza. There are earlier descriptions of pilgrims. For example, Jerome's description of Paula's pilgrimage, which dates to about 400, as well as texts by Theodosius, which is a shorter text, and the Breviarius. However, those tend to be shorter, or they're describing someone else. It's not until we get to the Piacenza pilgrim that we get a sustained first-person narrative that explains motivations and things like that. In the case of the Piacenza pilgrim, he records his travels in Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Transjordan, Sinai, and Egypt. Some of you may know this one as well, sometimes referred to as Antoninus in an earlier tradition, and that's because the person Antoninus is described in the beginning. However, that doesn't seem to be the author of the text. He seems to be referring to another Antoninus from Piacenza. All right, a couple of things to note about this particular pilgrim and how he differs from the others. Springs and water are still figured prominently as proofs. However, in the Piacenza pilgrim's text, there are a variety of other demonstrations of the authenticity of sites that occur with greater frequency than they do in earlier pilgrims' text. Those include vestigia, or vestiges, sort of imprints of holy figures. Those include the Lord's chest impression on the column of the scourging, the impression of the Lord's foot at the praetorium, and a cloak with the impression of Jesus' face. He sees this one in Egypt. However, that idea of the impression of Jesus' face on a cloth will later become prominent at EDESSA as well, with the idea of the mantilion. But he sees one in Egypt. There are also relics that appear. The abecedarium of Jesus in his boyhood synagogue in Nazareth. Yeah, some of you look incredulous, but he goes to what's presented to him as Jesus' boyhood synagogue, and he sees his abecedarium. He sees the places where Jesus learned his alphabet. Maybe to say a little bit more about that example, that one is demonstrated as the authentic place to pilgrims by having Christians try to move the desks and chairs in there. Christians can do it, but Jews can't, which for the Piacenza pilgrim demonstrates that this is in fact Jesus' boyhood synagogue. So not the kind of proofs we might accept today, but it works for the Piacenza pilgrim, and that's what's presented to him. There are a few other ones that are maybe worth noting here. He sees the sign placed over Jesus' head during the crucifixion. He sees the cup from the Last Supper. As we'll talk about in a bit, he sees the saw that cut Isaiah in half, which is a post-biblical tradition. And he sees the skull of a martyr at Zion, which he drinks from, which we'll talk about in a moment. He also encounters a number of souvenirs, ampullae with oil and water, dates. So he gets dates at Jericho, really giant dates, which are still really good today. So really giant dates, which he says he's going to bring home to give to a local official in Piacenza. So he sees those as well. And a tame lion, which I had to throw in here just because it's such a distinctive example, which he and his traveling companion do not manage to acquire, but this one in his account is near Elusa. And it's a tame lion that a wealthy man he's traveling with really wants to acquire. But the nuns won't give it up for any price. And this one, I just love the idea of, what I'd like to bring back from the Holy Land is a tame lion. But he doesn't get it, so it stayed there. He also describes graffiti. So this is something that is in evidence from inscriptions from this period, in particular from Sinai and some other places. But here we have a pilgrim who's actually describing writing it. One of the interesting things about his graffiti is that he doesn't write his own name. He writes his parents' name. So he writes his parents' name because of the idea that it will confer a blessing on his parents, which I think is interesting because it should probably inform how we read the graffiti that we have, that everyone might not represent the name of the actual pilgrim. They could write the name of someone else in their place. It also might be another form of authentication. In this case, he's leaving something of himself behind. So you take a souvenir with you, but you're also leaving something of yourself in place, which serves as proof that you made the journey as well. So you can see it kind of moving, working both ways there. And I have the picture here of the modern-day wedding church at Cana. And it's a little bit hard to make out in that photo, but you can see the do not sign with a little hand and so I have not seen that at another pilgrimage church. Maybe if you know of one, you can tell me. But I've been trying to keep an eye out, but it's at this one in Cana, which says, do not write on the walls, which tells me that people try to write on the walls. And in doing so, they're following in maybe the best tradition of the Piacenza pilgrim, although I don't know if they're writing the names of their parents or not. So interesting kind of continuation in that way. One of the places he goes to is the same as the pilgrim from Bordeaux, but the way he describes Jacob's well, you can see some of the changes that happen at the site. Where he says, at Neapolis, there's the well, here describing it as a Putius, where the Lord asked the Samaritan woman for water. Where there has been made a basilica dedicated to St. John. The well is in front of the chancel of the altar, and there is a bowl, a situlus, about which it is said, it is the very one from which the Lord drank, and many illnesses are healed there. So in this case, you don't just have the well, you've also got the Lord's bowl there too. And drinking from it brings about cures. So in this case, you see an additional relic which helps to confirm the well, just as the well confirms the relic, and the miracles that are associated with it serve as a kind of confirmation of the authenticity of the whole thing as well. Here you also see the consumption of water, which is something that occurs in other places in the Piacenza pilgrim. Probably most famously when he's at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and drinks from the sponge used at the crucifixion. So that's being used for pilgrims in the 6th century as well. So just a few details about his visit to the Holy Sepulchre. This is one of the descriptions of the use of ampullae, which survive in significant numbers from the period. But here we have one of the textual descriptions of how they were used. And this is what he says. The Holy Cross, having proceeded out of its cubiculum for veneration, having been brought into the atrium, it is venerated there. And at that moment, a star appears in the sky and comes over the spot where the cross has been placed. And while the cross is being venerated, the star remains over it, and oil is offered to be blessed within ampullas. When the wood of the cross touches the ampullas, the oil flows over. Unless it is quickly contained, it all flows out. And you can see one of the Manza Babio style ampullae on the right, which describes in the Greek text oil of the wood of life from the holy places of Christ. So presumably used for a purpose similar to that that the Piacenza pilgrim is describing. Some other things to note here, I mean, in this case we have kind of astral confirmation as well, where a star moves and stays in place and that sort of thing. So an alteration of the sky, the miracle of the boiling of the, or the bubbling over of the oil and so forth. And in this case, the acquisition of pilgrims of something they can take home. So another way to authenticate one's journey. Right. While he's at the Holy Sepulchre, he mentions this. He says, at a crack by the altar of Abraham and Melchizedek, next to Golgotha, you can hear rivers of water, and if you throw an apple or anything else into it, and you go to the fountain of Siloam, you can pick it up. I think that between Siloam and Golgotha is a mile, for Jerusalem does not have a water source beside the Siloam fountain. Now, I guess I don't want to get into many debates about the logistics of how this apple got there, although that might be kind of interesting. But it is a very evocative description, you know, where he's going up to this altar, there's a crack, and he can kind of hear these rivers flowing. Elsewhere in his account, he describes the miraculous powers of the Siloam pool. So in this description, it's this idea that there are kind of these waters that connect the various holy sites in Jerusalem, which is a really interesting kind of description and image. Maybe. He goes on to Mount Zion, and the church of Mount Zion, you can see what's probably at the far right end of the Vignette of Jerusalem on the Madaba map. And this is what he says. In Mount Zion, in his account, and some others from earlier in the 500s, the church of Mount Zion seems to have collected a number of relics. They appear there. And he says, then we came to the Basilica of Holy Zion, where there are many amazing things, among which is the cornerstone, which is spoken about, which was rejected by the builders. You can hold it and lift it in your hands and place your ear in the same corner, and there sounds in your ears something like many men murmuring. So some of you might know the story. I mean, what he's talking about here is a literal stone, where in the gospel story it's a figurative stone. So this is based on the story where Jesus is the stone that the builders have rejected. He has actually found the stone that the builders have rejected. So in this case, it's an actual stone that's shown there. And how is it confirmed? Well, in this case, it's auditory. You can hear the crowds murmuring. So this one I think is interesting in that it can find some parallels in those earlier Greek and Roman accounts of kind of auditory confirmation of holy sites and so forth. So you have that one here. He goes on from there and describes some of the vestiges that I talked about earlier. And he mentions this one. This is in the middle of that middle section. He's talking about where Jesus grabbed the column and his chest is impressed into it. He says that people take measures of it. So in other words, they're kind of taking cords or something and taking measures of the thing, and then that has potency on its own, so it can be brought home. So it's one more way in which the authenticity of those vestiges is demonstrated by the miraculous effects of the measures. And then the last one, I saw the head of a person encased in a small chamber of gold decorated with gems, which they said was the head of the holy martyr Theodota, and which many were drinking water for a blessing. And then I like this last part, and I drink too. So he does this for a blessing. This one is striking in a number of ways, in part because if you're thinking about earlier Greek, Roman, and Jewish tradition, ideas of ritual contamination would prevent you from doing this. In this case, it's not only acceptable, he gets a blessing for doing it as well. All right, so just a few more examples from the Piacenza Pilgrim. This one at Eleutheropolis, he says there's a spring that flows, which waters that place up to the present day. And he says, for we went even to the place where the spring originates. Thereupon we came to the place where Zechariah was killed, and lies in the body in a beautiful ornate basilica, and there are many servants of God there. Then we came to the place where Isaiah was severed by a saw. Indeed, he cast it off, the saw which was placed as proof, pro testimonium as posita, next to the sanctuary of Zechariah. And this one, like some others we've seen, has both the well and a relic. This one I think is interesting because the pilgrim is explicit about why it's being placed there. It's placed there as evidence, as proof that this happened. In this case, reflecting the post-biblical tradition concerning the death of Isaiah. And in terms of those post-biblical traditions, this one may be one of the most famous descriptions from the Piacenza Pilgrim, where he talks about the site of Kathisma. It says, on the road which leads to Bethlehem, at the 3rd mile from Jerusalem, Rachel lies in the body at the edge of that place called Ramah. At that place I saw in the middle of the road a pool of water which flowed from rocks, perhaps 7 sextarias, from which everyone fills, and it neither diminishes nor grows larger. It is indescribably sweet to drink. It is said about it that St. Mary, when she was fleeing to Egypt, sat in that location and was thirsty, and thus water flowed. There a church has now been built. So he seems to describe the church that was built there in his day. The confirmation comes from the kind of unique way in which it flows, but never overflows and so forth. And like our earlier pilgrims, it also has indescribably sweet taste. So that's important as well. And then one final example for today, which I think brings together a number of the things we've looked at with the Piacenza Pilgrim. And I won't read the whole text, but just the parts that are underlined. Here he's describing Epiphany at the Jordan and the rituals of baptism there. And he says, the priest goes into the river, and when he begins to bless the water, at once the Jordan flows back on itself with a roar, and the water stays until the baptism is completed. And all the Alexandrian ship owners have their men there that day, holding large jars full of spices and perfume. And at the time when they have blessed the water, before the baptisms begin, they all pour the jars into the water and then draw out the blessed water, and then they use the water for sprinkling on their ships. And then, just a little bit more, when the baptism is completed, everyone goes into the water for a blessing, dressed in linen, and many with other materials which they will wear in the grave. So here you have the kind of miraculous behavior of the water at a certain time of year, which confirms both the location of the crossing of the Jordan in Joshua as well as the location of Christ's baptism. And you also have the taking of souvenirs, in this case the water being so potent that it can be brought all the way to Alexandria and used to bless ships. There's also this description of people wearing this clothing that they will wear in the grave, which is an interesting image as well in terms of the holiness of certain kinds of souvenirs. So you can kind of see a number of types of confirmation and authenticity being demonstrated in this case. And in case you thought, in case you thought this didn't go on anymore, as the box says here, you can take, take a part of the Holy Land with you. So in this case, you actually can get a whole kit that has some oil, some soil, and some water to be brought back as a demonstration of the authenticity of your trip to the Holy Land, and perhaps, if you believe it has miraculous powers, demonstrating authenticity in that way as well. So I'll go ahead and close there for today, and I'll be happy to have any questions if we have time.
Great, thank you, Rangar. Questions? I will hand around the microphone and we'll bring the microphone back for an answer. Who would like to start? Okay.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I was curious, when these stories of miracles are told, is there any thought as to whether these travelers are witnessing these, or are they just being told and passing along the stories? For example, the apple and the well.
We're going to get a few more mics next time.
All right. I think in the case of the Piacenza Pilgrim, some things he seems to see himself, and then sometimes he signals that he hasn't seen certain things. So some things, and sometimes he uses language like, it is said about it, or something like that. So he sometimes gives you a kind of tip-off that maybe he hasn't seen all of these things himself. About the Siloam pool, I don't know, I have my own kind of theories about what might be going on that doesn't involve an actual conduit. But if people are washing some things in the Siloam pool at that point and there's actually fruit bobbing around, maybe you go down and an apple kind of looks like an apple, and you go down and you see it there, so, but maybe.
Thanks so much. This is just fascinating. I know that your pilgrim examples didn't include this site, but in the corpus that you're working on in general, do you have the example of the miracle in the water at the Paneon, at the sanctuary of Pan, where you know which one I'm talking about?
I should, so maybe we can talk about it.
So the answer is just no. Is that right?
The better answer is I want to, so we can talk about it.
So do we have an idea of the seasons that they're traveling? Is there a specific time because it's dry, the water is an impression, something that they're very impressed with and they have to tell us about? Or is it the winter season and everything's full of water?
Yeah, in some cases you can tell, like if there's something like the Feast of Epiphany, then you can link it to a particular religious holiday. In other cases, it's a little bit more difficult. For example, EGERIA describes traveling around for about 3 years. In some cases, she's talking about specific events in Jerusalem and things like that, so you can kind of link it to those. In other cases, in particular with the Piacenza pilgrim, there may even be some cases where the text presents his travels in a way that's a little bit out of order. So it might even be more difficult in that way to link it with a particular time of year. However, that's an interesting question in terms of the practical use of water and how much water would be in certain springs at different times of year. Yeah.
I will ask a question. I know the sources are few, but does one get a sense of when these particular places become associated with miracles and that sort of thing? And is there anything common among them from a temporal point of view?
Yeah, in terms of the question of the timing of certain places, the ones that the Bordeaux pilgrim describes, many of those are connected with Jewish patriarchs and things like that, which suggests to me and a number of others that he's kind of tapping into an earlier tradition of Jewish pilgrimage that's already present there. However, yeah, by the early 4th century, there are other places he's going to too, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And there are a number of sites like that that are described by Eusebius that they're sometimes referred to as the cave sites, so where you have caves. So you've got a cave at the Holy Sepulchre, a cave on the Mount of Olives, and a cave at Bethlehem. And I didn't talk about caves today, but that's another kind of natural feature that exists in the present that you can link back to the past. So that's probably one of the reasons that those sites are so prominent so early, even in some places where it's a little bit counterintuitive, like on the Mount of Olives. It's not, you know, if you're celebrating the Ascension, you wouldn't automatically think of a cave, but the tradition develops about Jesus' teaching and meals and so forth that connects it with the cave. So, yeah, some of them are earlier, some of them are 4th century. If you're looking at the Piacenza pilgrim, there are more sites with more things. So it does kind of evolve over time.
Apropos older traditions, the word pagan comes from the Greek word for spring. There are springs mentioned here.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the word pagan, there are some different traditions surrounding its meaning and the way it's used in the 4th century and afterwards. However, in terms of springs, there's a long tradition of the veneration of springs, both because of their association with stories like the ones I talked about, and in other cases where they're associated with particular nymphs and divine beings on their own. So in a way, it's kind of tapping into an earlier tradition of holy sites, but it is kind of putting a distinctive Christian take on it. Another thing that I think is interesting is if we are looking at this as using a kind of language and tradition that's part of Greek and Roman culture prior to the 4th century, by encouraging pilgrims to go there and to write about it and to use that language, rather than seeing pilgrimage as something that's really new, in some ways what these pilgrims are doing is participating in something that's already part of Mediterranean culture, and they're presenting these sites in a way that a broader Greek and Roman audience would understand. In other words, it's a demonstration of the authenticity of Christian holy places in the Holy Land in the terms and using a language that's already current in the Greek and Roman world. So I think that's kind of where my research is going in its kind of final conclusion.